The morning Alexander turned 20, his father Philip lay dead in a pool of blood, and within hours the greatest military mind in history faced a choice that would reshape the ancient world forever. Execute the conspirators and secure the throne, or watch Macedonia tear itself apart in civil war. He chose neither. Instead, he did something so audacious that even his own generals thought he had lost his mind. He forgave his enemies, promoted them to his inner circle, and then announced he would conquer the Persian Empire, the largest, wealthiest, most powerful civilization on earth, with an army smaller than a single Persian province. Most kings inherit crowns. Alexander inherited chaos. But in the span of 13 years, he would transform that chaos into an empire stretching from Greece to India, covering over 2 million square miles. He never lost a single battle. He founded 70 cities. He changed the course of human civilization, and he did it all before his 33rd birthday. This is not just the story of a conqueror. This is the blueprint of how one man's vision became the ancient world's reality. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Alexander's greatest victories weren't won on battlefields. They were won in the minds of his enemies before the fighting even began. While other generals planned tactics, Alexander engineered psychology. Where others saw obstacles, he saw opportunities. And when the impossible stood in his way, he redefined what possible meant. By the end of this story, you'll understand why military academies still study his strategies, why philosophers debate his methods, and why his name echoes through 23 centuries as the gold standard of leadership under pressure. The year was 336 BCE, and Macedonia was a kingdom balanced on the edge of a knife. Philip II had spent 20 years building the most advanced military machine the world had ever seen. The phalanx formation, 18-foot spears called sarissas, siege engines that could crack any wall, and cavalry units trained to strike like lightning. But Philip's greatest achievement wasn't military, it was political. He had united the fractured Greek city-states under Macedonian leadership, something no king had managed in centuries. Then came the wedding that changed everything. Philip was marrying his seventh wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, and the celebration was supposed to cement Macedonia's power for generations. Instead, it became a stage for assassination. As Philip entered the theater, unarmed and unguarded, his bodyguard Pausanias struck him down with a single dagger thrust. The king who had conquered Greece died in front of 1,000 witnesses, and suddenly the strongest kingdom in the ancient world had no leader. Alexander was in the mountains, campaigning against Illyrian tribes when the news reached him. 20 years old, untested in major command, and now facing the most dangerous political crisis in Macedonian history. The Greek city-state saw opportunity in Philip's death. Thebes revolted immediately. Athens began mobilizing. The northern barbarian tribes sensed weakness and prepared to invade. Even within Macedonia, rival claimants emerged, backed by Persian gold and promises of power. Any normal heir would have spent months securing the throne, negotiating with rivals, appeasing the Greek cities. Alexander spent 3 days. On the first day, he executed the obvious conspirators, but spared their families. On the second day, he summoned the Macedonian assembly and was acclaimed king by acclamation. On the third day, he announced his intention to continue Philip's planned invasion of Persia. The speed was breathtaking. The audacity was unprecedented. The psychology was brilliant. Because Alexander understood something his enemies did not. Hesitation breeds doubt, and doubt breeds rebellion. But decisive action, even reckless action, creates momentum. And momentum becomes unstoppable when it's backed by competence. Within weeks, he had marched south with an army of 35,000 men, not to negotiate with the rebellious Greeks, but to remind them why they had submitted to his father in the first place. Thebes had been counting on support from other city-states. They found themselves facing the Macedonian war machine alone. Alexander surrounded the city in 13 days and offered terms. surrender, pay tribute, accept Macedonian garrisons, or face complete destruction. The Thebans chose defiance. They believed their walls were impregnable, their soldiers the finest in Greece, their cause just. They were wrong on all three counts. The siege lasted exactly 3 hours. Alexander's engineers had studied Theban fortifications for years under Philip's orders. They knew every weakness, every structural flaw, every point where focused pressure could create catastrophic failure. The assault began at dawn with siege engines targeting specific wall sections while cavalry units sealed escape routes. By noon, Macedonian infantry was fighting in the city's central plaza. By sunset, Thebes had ceased to exist. But here's where Alexander revealed the calculating mind behind the warrior facade. He didn't just destroy Thebes, he erased it. Every building except temples and the house of the poet Pindar was demolished stone by stone. 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city's territory was distributed among neighboring states that had remained loyal. The message was clear and terrifying. Rebellion against Macedonia meant not just defeat, but obliteration from history. Yet even as Alexander demonstrated ruthless efficiency against enemies, he showed unexpected mercy to those who submitted. Athens, which had been preparing for war, sent ambassadors begging forgiveness. Alexander received them with honor, confirmed their autonomy, and even returned Athenian prisoners captured in previous campaigns. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. Submit, and Macedonia was a generous protector. Resist, and Macedonia was an implacable destroyer. This dual approach became Alexander's signature strategy throughout his campaigns. Terror and mercy, destruction and generosity, calculated cruelty and unexpected kindness. His enemies never knew which Alexander they would face, and that uncertainty became its own weapon. Because when you cannot predict your opponent's response, you cannot plan effectively against them. Within 6 months of his father's death, Alexander had secured Macedonia, crushed Greek rebellion, and intimidated the northern barbarian tribes into submission. But these were merely preparatory moves. The real target had always been Persia, the empire that dwarfed all others, ruled by Darius III from his palace in Persepolis. An empire with unlimited gold, countless soldiers, and naval supremacy across the eastern Mediterranean. An empire that had dominated the ancient world for over 2 centuries. Most military advisors counseled patience. Build up more forces, secure additional allies, wait for internal Persian conflicts to weaken their resistance. Alexander rejected every cautious strategy. In spring 334 BCE, he crossed the Hellespont with 35,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and a siege train that could breach any fortification, against an empire that could field armies 10 times that size. But Alexander possessed something more valuable than numerical superiority. He had studied Persian military doctrine, understood their command structure, and identified their critical weakness. The Persian army was magnificent in set-piece battles on level ground, but their commanders were bureaucrats appointed for political loyalty, not military competence. Their troops were brave but poorly coordinated across cultural and linguistic barriers. Their strategies were predictable because they relied on overwhelming force rather than tactical innovation. Most importantly, Alexander understood that the Persian Empire's greatest strength was also its greatest vulnerability. It was vast beyond imagination, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, encompassing dozens of cultures, languages, and traditions held together by administrative efficiency and military intimidation. But that same vastness meant that news traveled slowly. Reinforcements took months to arrive, and local governors operated with dangerous independence. Alexander planned to exploit every one of these weaknesses, but first he had to survive his initial encounter with Persian forces. That test came sooner than anyone expected, at a river crossing that would determine whether his invasion ended in its first month or continued toward immortality. The Granicus River ran red with blood on a spring morning in 334 BCE, but the crimson wasn't from Alexander's army. It belonged to the Persian satraps who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating a 22-year-old Macedonian king. They had positioned themselves perfectly for a conventional river-crossing battle: cavalry on the heights, infantry in reserve, missiles ready to rain down on any force attempting to ford the water. What they hadn't prepared for was Alexander's complete rejection of conventional warfare. While his generals argued for flanking maneuvers and careful reconnaissance, Alexander studied the Persian formation and saw something his enemies couldn't imagine: opportunity disguised as suicide. The Persians expected him to probe for weaknesses, to test their defenses, to behave like every other general they had faced. Instead, Alexander ordered a direct frontal assault across the river at its deepest point, leading the charge himself with his elite companion cavalry. The Persians watched in disbelief as the Macedonian king plunged into the current, his bronze armor gleaming in the morning sun, his lance aimed straight at their strongest position. It looked like madness. It was madness. But it was calculated madness backed by months of intelligence gathering and tactical preparation. Because Alexander had discovered something crucial about Persian military psychology. They were trained to respond to predictable threats, not impossible ones. The shock of seeing an enemy king personally leading a seemingly suicidal charge created exactly 3 seconds of hesitation in the Persian ranks. 3 seconds where their formation wavered, where their cavalry horses shifted nervously, where their commanders questioned what they were witnessing. Alexander had gambled his entire campaign on those 3 seconds, and they were enough. His companion cavalry smashed into the Persian line like a bronze thunderbolt, scattering defenders who were still processing the impossibility of the attack. Behind them, Macedonian infantry crossed at multiple points while the Persians were focused on the cavalry engagement. Within minutes, the textbook defensive position had become a chaotic melee where Persian numerical superiority meant nothing and Macedonian training meant everything. But the real genius of Alexander's Granicus strategy wasn't the shock tactics. It was the aftermath. When the battle ended with complete Persian defeat, Alexander faced his first major decision as conqueror. The captured Persian nobles expected execution or ransom, standard practice in ancient warfare. Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia expected slavery or death. Local populations expected pillaging and subjugation. Alexander gave them something unprecedented. He released the Persian nobles without ransom, on condition they spread word of Macedonian clemency throughout the satrapies. He executed the Greek mercenaries as traitors to Hellenism, sending a clear message about the price of fighting against Greek interests. But the local populations received protection, respect for their customs, and continuation of their administrative systems under new management. This wasn't mercy. It was strategic brilliance. Every released Persian noble became an unwitting agent of Macedonian propaganda. Every protected city became proof that Alexander offered better governance than Darius. Every respectful treatment of local customs demonstrated that Macedonian rule meant prosperity, not oppression. Within weeks, Persian governors across western Anatolia were opening their gates without resistance. The psychological impact rippled across the empire faster than any army could march. Darius III, receiving reports in Persepolis, faced a problem no Persian king had encountered in 2 centuries. His western provinces weren't just being conquered, they were being seduced. Cities that should have resisted to the death were welcoming Macedonian forces. Governors who should have died fighting were switching sides. The very foundation of Persian authority, based on fear and administrative efficiency, was crumbling before a completely different model of leadership. Alexander understood what modern strategists would later call hearts and minds warfare. Military victory was meaningless without political consolidation. Conquered territories became liabilities unless their populations accepted new rule as legitimate. Traditional Persian methods relied on overwhelming force followed by harsh suppression. Alexander offered something revolutionary: partnership in a greater destiny. As his army advanced through coastal Anatolia, each city presented the same choice: resist and face the fate of Thebes, or submit and join an empire that promised prosperity, security, and respect for local traditions. The mathematics were simple, but the psychology was complex. Because Alexander wasn't just offering survival, he was offering participation in something legendary. City after city opened its gates. Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia, surrendered without a siege. Ephesus welcomed Macedonian forces as liberators. Miletus, despite its massive fortifications, negotiated submission rather than face destruction. Each peaceful conquest freed Alexander's forces for more ambitious targets while demonstrating to remaining Persian strongholds that resistance was futile. But the crown jewel of western Anatolia was Halicarnassus, the fortress city ruled by Memnon of Rhodes, the one Persian commander who truly understood Macedonian capabilities. Memnon had studied under Greek military instructors, had fought alongside and against Macedonian forces, and possessed both the tactical knowledge and political authority to organize effective resistance. He transformed Halicarnassus into a death trap designed specifically to neutralize Alexander's advantages. The city's harbor was protected by a massive chain boom that prevented naval assault. Its landward walls incorporated the latest Greek defensive innovations, with interlocking fields of fire and kill zones that would devastate attacking infantry. Most importantly, Memnon had stockpiled supplies for a year-long siege, while coordinating with Persian naval forces to maintain supply lines and reinforce the garrison. For the first time in his campaign, Alexander faced an enemy who matched his tactical sophistication with superior strategic position. Conventional assault would result in massive casualties with uncertain success. Blockade would take months while allowing Darius time to organize counteroffensives. Bypassing the city would leave a dangerous enemy fortress controlling vital supply routes. Alexander chose none of these options. Instead, he did something that redefined siege warfare forever. Rather than attacking Halicarnassus directly, he attacked the idea of Halicarnassus. He began constructing a second city adjacent to the fortress, complete with walls, harbors, and administrative buildings. Not a temporary siege camp, but a permanent settlement designed to outlast any defensive strategy. The message was unmistakable and terrifying. Alexander wasn't just besieging Halicarnassus, he was replacing it. Even if the fortress held out indefinitely, its economic and political importance would gradually transfer to Alexander's new foundation. Trade routes would shift, administrative functions would relocate. The great fortress would become an irrelevant monument to outdated strategic thinking. Memnon understood the implications immediately. Military victory meant nothing if political victory was impossible. His fortress could resist Macedonian assault, but it couldn't resist Macedonian patience backed by superior resources. After 3 months of stalemate, he abandoned Halicarnassus and retreated to sea, where Persian naval supremacy still offered tactical advantages. But Alexander had already won the greater battle. The fall of Halicarnassus eliminated the last organized resistance in western Anatolia and demonstrated that no defensive position, however strong, could withstand Macedonian strategic innovation. More importantly, it proved that Alexander thought in terms of decades, not seasons. His enemies could win battles, but they couldn't win the war because they couldn't match his vision of what victory actually meant. With Anatolia secured, Alexander faced his next great challenge. The Persian heartland lay across the Taurus Mountains, through passes controlled by enemy forces, and into regions where Darius himself was marshaling the full might of the Persian Empire. Everything achieved so far had been preparation for this moment. The real test of Alexander's destiny was about to begin. The mountain passes that guarded the Persian heartland had never been breached by a foreign army. Carved from solid rock and defended by fortresses that commanded every approach, The Cilician Gates represented 2 centuries of strategic engineering designed to funnel any invasion force into predetermined kill zones. Persian engineers had studied every historical attempt to cross the Taurus Range, and their defensive preparations reflected that accumulated knowledge. Narrow defiles where cavalry became useless, overlapping fields of fire from elevated positions, supply choke points that could starve entire armies. The passes weren't just barriers, they were execution chambers. Darius III had positioned his most experienced mountain fighters in those heights, men who knew every trail, every hidden approach, every weakness in the terrain that might tempt an overconfident invader. They carried signals fires that could alert the entire Persian command structure within hours of any enemy movement. They possessed stockpiled ammunition, prepared rock slides, and engineering tools to collapse passages behind retreating forces. Most importantly, they had orders to hold at all costs while Darius completed assembly of the largest army in human history. Alexander spent 3 weeks studying those mountains. His scouts mapped every visible position, every potential vulnerability, every tactical consideration that might influence the coming assault. His engineers calculated approach angles, siege requirements, and casualty projections for conventional attacks. His intelligence officers interviewed local merchants, shepherds, and tribal leaders who knew the region's hidden geography. The accumulated data painted a clear picture. Direct assault would fail. Flanking maneuvers were impossible. Waiting for winter would allow Darius unlimited time for preparation. But while his staff focused on tactical problems, Alexander examined strategic possibilities. The Persian mountain defense was mathematically perfect for preventing armies from crossing the passes. It was completely inadequate for preventing individual soldiers from crossing separately and reassembling on the far side. The fortifications assumed conventional warfare between organized formations. They weren't designed to stop what Alexander planned next. On a moonless night in late autumn, Alexander divided his army into 17 separate units, each following different routes through terrain the Persians considered impassable. Not the obvious paths that led to fortified choke points, but animal trails, dry riverbeds, and cliff faces that required climbing equipment rather than marching formations. Each unit carried minimum supplies and maximum mobility. Each followed guides who knew their specific route intimately. Each had orders to reach designated assembly points regardless of what happened to other units. Alexander the Great died at 32. His empire stretching across 3 continents, his legend carved into the bedrock of human memory. But his true victory wasn't territorial. It was proving that audacity backed by intelligence can reshape reality itself. When impossibility blocks your path, you don't find another route. You redefine what's possible. Because greatness isn't inherited, it's engineered, one impossible decision at a time.